Romans chapter 11. Therefore consider the goodness and the severity of God. Romans chapter 11 is a continuation of the Apostle Paul's discussion about the relationship between Jews and Gentiles in God's plan of salvation. In the previous chapters, Paul explained that both Jews and Gentiles are all under sin and in need of salvation, which is found in Jesus Christ. Paul also emphasized that salvation is by faith, apart from works of the law. In chapter 11, Paul addresses the question of whether God has completely rejected the Jewish people and replaced them with the Gentiles. Exegesis by sections and verses. Verses 1 to 6. The preservation of a remnant. Paul begins by asking the rhetorical question, has God rejected his people? He emphatically answers, by no means. He then explains that he himself is a Jew and that God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Paul cites the example of the prophet Elijah, who thought he was the only faithful Jew left, but God revealed to him that he had reserved 7,000 who had not bowed their knee to Baal. Paul uses this example to show that God has always preserved a remnant of faithful Jews who have not rejected him. Verses 7 to 10. Israel's stumbling and God's plan. Paul then asks another rhetorical question, what then, has Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking? The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. The rest were hardened, which means they were spiritually blinded and unable to see the truth of the gospel. Paul quotes from the book of Psalms to show that this was part of God's plan. Verses 11 to 16. Gentiles grafted into the olive tree. Paul then addresses the question of whether Israel's stumbling has led to their permanent rejection. He asks if their stumbling has led to their final fall, and again answers, by no means. He explains that Israel's stumbling has led to salvation coming to the Gentiles, which in turn will provoke Israel to jealousy and lead to their salvation. Paul uses the analogy of an olive tree to explain that Gentiles have been grafted into the root of Israel, the natural tree, and they share in the nourishing sap of the tree. However, he warns the Gentiles not to boast against the branches, because they are only there by grace. Verses 17 to 24. Warning against Gentile arrogance and the hope for Israel. Paul continues with the analogy of the olive tree and warns the Gentiles not to become proud or arrogant, because if they do, they too will be cut off from the tree. He says, therefore consider the goodness and severity of God, on those who fell, severity, but toward you, goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. He reminds the Gentiles that they are only there by faith and that God can cut them off if they do not continue in faith. Paul also holds out hope for the Jewish people, saying that if they do not persist in their unbelief, they can be grafted back into the tree. Verses 25 to 32. The mystery of God's plan unveiled. Paul then discusses the mystery of God's plan for both Jews and Gentiles. He explains that a partial hardening has come upon Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Then all Israel will be saved, as it is written in the prophets. Paul emphasizes that God's mercy extends to both Jews and Gentiles, and that all have been disobedient so that he may have mercy on all. Verses 33 to 36. Paul praises for God's wisdom and knowledge. Paul concludes this section with a doxology, praising the wisdom and knowledge of God, who is beyond human understanding. Overall summary. In Romans chapter 11, Paul addresses the question of whether God has rejected his people, the Jews. He concludes that God has not rejected them, but has a plan to bring them back into the fold. Paul also warns the Gentile believers not to become arrogant or boastful, but to remember that their inclusion in the kingdom of God is only through the grace of God. He uses the analogy of an olive tree to explain how the Gentiles have been grafted in, while some of the natural branches, the Jews, were broken off due to unbelief. Paul also warns the Gentiles that they too could be cut off if they don't continue in faith. He declares that a partial hardening has come upon Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and then all Israel will be saved. Paul concludes with a doxology, praising the wisdom and knowledge of God.